Today we're working on a 2007 Volkswagen Jetta, and we're going to show you how you can replace the front wheel bearing spindle assembly using the tools that you see in front of us. The tools you'll need are a impact gun, electric or air, a 24mm socket, a 21mm deep, a 17mm deep, and a 16mm deep, or just deep enough to get the ball joint bolts off. You'll need a 12 triple square bit socket. You'll also need to have a couple of extensions, a T30 Torx bit. We used a 3/8 electric impact, but you could also just use any tool that you would use that has slight impact ability. We have our torque wrench, 1/2-inch breaker bar, some compressed air, a 3/8 ratchet with a deep 16 so we can put the ball joints back on. We have a bungee cord to hold the caliper assembly, and we have two flathead screwdrivers, one that we use as a pry tool because it's been damaged earlier, your little pick fork so that you can grab your little covers over top of the wheel studs, a wire brush to get the rust off, a small assortment of rubber mallets and a hammer, and then your safety gear along with your anti-seize lubricant, blue Loctite, brake parts cleaner, and we do have a small little propane torch so that we can heat up some of those tough tabs and heat up those ears so we can get those screws out or get those bolts out. And then lastly, of course, your jack stand, jack, and wheel chuck. The first thing you're going to do is jack up your car with a jack and then put it on a jack stand underneath the control arm. Make sure that you have a stop or a wheel chock on the back tires so that you have a pretty stable setup. The next thing you'll do is you'll grab a pick and you'll remove these wheel stud covers. Actually, these are actually bolts. They're not even studs. And save them for later. Next, we're going to use a 17mm socket with our 1/2-inch electric impact. If you don't have one of these, you'll remove the lug nuts, you'll loosen them on the ground with the parking brake set and a breaker bar. Now the last one requires a little security bit, which you can find in your glove box or in your flat tire kit. Then we'll just give this a light tap, sometimes a Sparta kick. And with a Sparta kick, you move it out of the way, and I like to use it as my seat. So before I start to remove anything, the first thing that I always go after is this little screw right here. And this holds on the rotor to the spindle itself. So I have my little T30 Torx bit, and I'm just gonna buzz it off. The next angle I'm going to show you is actually from the side and behind this caliper rotor assembly. But what I do is I don't take the caliper off the caliper bracket. I remove this as one entire assembly and put a bungee cord up on the strut to hold it all together. I'm going to go ahead, put my bungee cord up inside the strut tower. And because mine's long, I'm just going to loop it through the springs just to shorten it up so it holds the caliper bracket and assembly together. And then with a flathead screwdriver, I'm going to come on the inside between the pad, the rotor, and the caliper, and I'm just going to pry this, which will collapse the piston inside the caliper. So as I'm prying this, it is loosening this whole assembly up so that I can slide it back and forth like this, and this will make our reassembly really easy. So don't skip this step. Now we have plenty of sliding room to go about. And now the next thing is I'm just going to move this little wheel speed sensor out of the way, and I'm going to show you how that goes together, and then we are going to access the two back caliper mounting bracket bolts. So just a quick recap, I put the screwdriver between this part of the rotor and wedged it inside here so it was kind of at this angle, and I just pried it forward. And now you can see that there's a good gap, if we can get some focus, between the pad and the rotor, which allows us to move this caliper freely. Then we're going to remove the two caliper mounting bracket bolts, which is right here, and then one directly lower. So I'm going to set you guys up so you can kind of see what I'm doing for this. So the lower mounting bolt is here, and the upper mounting bolt is just over there, right underneath that ABS sensor wire. So I'm going to go ahead with my impact gun and remove those. But you could also do this with a 1/2-inch breaker bar. All right, so now with my 21mm, I'm going to remove the 2 bolts that are holding on the caliper bracket and caliper itself. And then I'm just going to hook these onto my little friend. Oh. And I'm sorry, I was mistaken. That is not the wheel speed sensor. That is actually your brake pad wear sensor. So these brake pads are getting pretty low and these rotors are getting pretty worn. So we're going to do front pads and rotors on this car at some point, and we'll shoot a video for that too. So now that I have that off, what I'm going to do is just remove this massive 27mm bolt which holds on the axle. Now if you're doing this on the ground or you're doing this at home and you don't have an impact gun, you're going to put this car back on the ground and you're going to remove the center cap of the wheel with the parking brake on. Maybe you have someone in the car with the foot brake on, and you'll break this nut loose with a breaker bar. But since we have the electric impact, we're just going to use that to save us some time. And we'll put that out of the way. So now that the rotor's ready to come off, we're gonna have to hit it off with a hammer because there hasn't been any anti-seize on the back of this rotor, and there's been a considerable buildup of rust. So it's pretty important that when you're doing this to use a rubber mallet, or if you use a metal mallet, just hammer around this edge here, because you don't want to touch any of the surface that the pad is going to be on, or else you're going to wear out the rotor, you're going to wear out the pad, and you're going to have a really bad vibration in your car. So we're going to start with the rubber mallet, and we're just going to give it a couple of good whacks. Now we're going to go to the back side. And voila. Now when we put this rotor back on, we're going to put some anti-seize so that it comes off easier next time. So with this out of the way, the next thing to do is to tap this axle out of its hole. You can use the nut that was holding the axle in, turn it in a bunch of good threads, and give it a good whacking. And if you're still having difficulty, you can just spray a little bit of rust penetrant in there and kind of help it work its way out. So with just that, I'm just gonna go back in, and keep tapping it out. And I'll spray it again. So on the passenger side, we have enough room to remove this axle all the way from the spindle without having to remove any of the ball joints. However, on the driver's side, we need to remove the lower ball joint. And the easiest way to do that is by removing 3 16mm bolts, which are on the other side of the control arm. So you go underneath, you have 3 16mm bolts, and you can just remove the lower control arm that way. Which then pops straight down and gives you the opportunity to move and get more freedom to pull out that axle. Right, so now I'll go ahead, put my bolt back in, and tap it the rest of the way through. And while I'm doing that, I'm pulling on the spindle and strut assembly to get it the rest of the way out. And now that that's out, we'll be able to easily move the axle out of the way and access the back triple square socket pieces that are holding on this spindle assembly. So this spindle assembly is held on by 4 bolts. You'll see 2 up top here. There's one that's poking out on the bottom, and then there's another one on the opposing side. And you get access to them with the axle removed, and we're at the back now, and you'll see them on the back. They are triple square sockets. So I'm gonna go in there with my M12 triple square socket, and that's what that guy looks like. I'll go ahead and remove them. Almost there. Ta-da! Nice. And what's keeping that so stuck in there is this awesome rust buildout that you get inside here. So we're gonna clean this up with a wire brush. This is your ABS wheel speed sensor right here. And when you're done, you just wanna make sure that you clean it off so that there's no metal, because any metal debris around there can cause a ABS malfunction, wheel speed sensor code, all that type of jazz. So we're gonna go ahead and install this right into its old position. It doesn't matter if it goes in up or down. And we're just gonna kind of walk it in, and then I'll get a little hammer and tap it in the rest of the way. I'm doing really light little taps here. You don't want to do anything too harsh or you'll mess it up. So nice little taps. And when I mean little, I'm literally like it doesn't hurt at all. That's just little tiny taps. If you have to go any harder than that, you don't have it in the right position and you're going to damage the bearings. So the next thing I'm doing is just making sure that everything's lined up. And with everything lined up, I can go ahead and start tightening them down. Now I kind of get them all pretty well seated. I don't torque them all the way down. I just get them all nice and snug, and then what I do is I back them all the way back out, and then I put the blue Loctite on there so they don't come out on me. So I'm just drawing everything in so it's nice and flush. Alrighty. Now that we have this all the way on and we have it torqued down, we're going to go ahead and reinstall the axle. What I'm going to go ahead and do is just spray a little bit of penetrating oil on it to help it glide in. Alright, now that we have the axle semi in here, got it all the way in, I'm going to go ahead and just thread this on so that the axle doesn't fall back out. And I'm just going to reinstall the ball joint by clipping it in and putting some blue Loctite on these bolts. Sorry. I'm putting some blue Loctite on these nuts. And the reason I'm putting Loctite on these nuts specifically is that these ones have been pinched a little bit, and what that means is that the bottom of it is round, but the top of it's kind of oval, and that is to be a self-securing nut so that it doesn't ever come back off. So you definitely have to put Loctite on that. All the other ones are fairly optional. I just put Loctite on everything because it's just really, you know, a safety measure for liability, and I don't have to worry about any phone calls from clients later saying that something feels loose or there's a noise. It's just a one and done type of deal. So I'll go ahead and snug those up. Then the next thing is to reinstall the caliper and pad assembly. I'm just going to put a little bit more blue Loctite on the caliper mounting bracket. These are the bolts that hold that bracket in place. Before I put this rotor on, I'm just going to put a little bit of anti-seize on the face of this spindle so that when we go to change this rotor, it just falls right off for us. Now I'm going to put the rotor on, and this rotor is totally trash, but we're going to be changing it in the next video. And all I'm going to do is get this guy lined up and hold this on. Now on most cars that have studs instead of where the bolt goes and holds on, you have wheel bolts instead of wheel studs, you don't always need to put that back on. But with this car, you really do, because if you don't have it on, it makes it very difficult to put the tire back on because the rotor doesn't have anything keeping it from moving about. So we got this guy in there. I'm just going to go ahead and snug it up a little bit. And remember how earlier we had compressed that piston, which just made this job much easier. Then with my bolts that already have Loctite on, I'm going to go ahead and put the caliper bracket back on. Next thing to do is to go ahead and torque everything back up. And we also had checked with our torque wrench the 4 bolts that hold on the spindle nut assembly.